receptacle, receptacle.
They could have blown it somewhere else on the circuit.
Yeah, Bill was there.
He wants to be an electrician for $50. No, it was a relative. This was all white, and the walls are white, and the receptacle cover is white.
Some of them have a black and red button, some of them.
Yeah, this is all white. And she...
You are, yes.
I do appreciate you all coming out and seeing the store and coming here a debut book. What was I going to say? Oh yes, turn your cell phones off, please. If you would. We have a lot of events here. Last year we had almost 80 events with authors in the store, and if you. They can hear me. You can hear me back there, right?
No.
Louder!
Not accustomed as I am to public speaking. Go to oblongbooks.com. Our website is pretty much up to date on everything that we're doing and going to do. Two new things. So one old thing, one new thing. We have what we call the Hudson Valley YA Society for young adult readers, and which has been really successful. We've had these great panels with 3 or 4 authors come in and talk about it, and kids learn about authors in the process of writing and get enthused about reading, which we think is probably the best thing people can do. We are now going to be launching that sort of a thing for younger readers. It's called the League of Extraordinary Readers. That'll be starting for middle grade readers in the days ahead, so please keep your eye on that. Those of us who grew up around here or have worked around here, the name Rokeby is not just the road you pass on Route 9G. It's this kind of mystical place, and I will admit that I had not seen a picture. I've never been to the house, and I've not seen a picture of this until I was reviewing Alexandra's work for in preparation to give this sterling introduction. It just, I've known people who live there, and it just, it has a reputation as a place where, at least in the last 20 years, a little, it's interesting. Shall we say? It's, it's got its share of characters, probably more than most. And now we have a wonderful book about a few years in that space that Alexandra, who was born here probably at Rhinebeck Hospital, I bet, and lived there for her formative years, shall we say. And she's written this wonderful book, The Astor Orphan, about her experience. And I don't know much more to say about that, except if you're curious about what's going on in Rookby, Alexandra's got a little story for you. Please welcome Alexandra Aldrich.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to introduce, begin by saying that everybody who's been to Rookby or has lived at Rookby has a Rookby story. And when I was growing up, I felt that I was living in someone else's Rookby story. I grew up in a 43-room mansion on a 450-acre estate, and I felt that the family history stopped in 1963 with the death of my great-grandmother, Margaret Chandler Aldrich. All the furniture remained exactly as it had when she was alive. We weren't allowed to touch, move, or use anything in the front of the house. And I grew up surrounded by the history, portraits and busts and artifacts from the adventures of my ancestors. And my uncle basically treated the house as a house museum, put it on the National Register for Historic Places, brought historical societies to tour the house. And I would never be warned ahead of time when these busloads of tourists would arrive. And so a coach bus would pull up in front of the house, 50 people would come out, and sometimes I'd be caught, and I would be in the hallway. And my uncle, without skipping a beat, would say, "This is my niece, Alexandra, the oldest of the next generation of Rookby's owners." And that was my title. That was who I was. To the outside world, that was my identity. And the rest of who I was not really mentioned. That wasn't part of the introduction ever. The daughter of a Polish artist, and the daughter of a Harvard-educated aristocrat / blue-collar handyman. So that part I understood from a young age was supposed to be kept secret, and that was only for people at Rookby to know about. And then in the outside world, I went to the local school here, so it was named Chancellor Livingston after my ancestor. So I felt like the local aristocrat, and I had my cousins and I did feel I had an obligation to uphold a certain image, to get straight A's, to play the violin as well as I could. I mentored my younger cousins, also teaching them about our family history and teaching them everything I knew, so that we could be extraordinary and represent the family and the class that we'd been born into. But until about the age of 10, I was under the illusion that nobody knew any other part about me. Because I didn't bring kids home from school generally, because I liked them to imagine. They all knew that I'd grown up and that I lived in a mansion, and I liked to keep the myth alive. I didn't want to bring them to my third floor, 3-room apartment where we actually lived in the servants' quarters, with makeshift furniture, which we weren't allowed to use. We weren't allowed to use the antiques because they were for show. So, but by the time at the age of 10, that's sort of my age of awareness, most of the narrative revolves around that time, when I begin to become aware of more shameful aspects of my life, like my grandmother's alcoholism. And I started to become aware also that the outside world also knew about these secrets that I started to see, because I was becoming aware. I started to see my grandmother drunk in public, and people would notice. So my facade basically cracked at that point, and I felt that I'd failed as an aristocrat, and I lost that sense of identity at that point. But on a lighter note, I'm going to read a chapter about my dad and me, which is towards the beginning of the book. It's called The Mentor. I raced out the double front doors, across the dusty circular driveway, and down the grassy hill toward Dad. Dad, I shouted, but he couldn't hear me over the roar of the tractor engine and mower blades. I was always on the lookout for Dad. I would scurry after him like a desperate pet, taking 3 steps for every one of his. "Wait up, Dad," I'd cry as I followed him on his daily rounds of the property, digging trenches and laying new water, waste, or electric lines, doing mechanical work on one of the farm's tractors, or nailing new shingles onto a barn roof. "You gotta keep up," he'd say, without turning around or adjusting his pace. Dad was always chasing his own father, Pop to him, Grandpa Dickie to me. In Rokeby's soil and barns, on the ice boats, along the electric and water lines, lay his early childhood memories of time spent with his father. Mowing, riding, fixing. These were pursuits they'd shared before the liquor had swept Grandpa Dickie into permanent oblivion, then premature death. Dad would wake up at 5 and then, over breakfast, write lists of things that needed to be done on the property. He never seemed to tire of it. When I finally caught up with the tractor, Dad slowed down for me. I hopped on, hoping to keep him from driving up to the big house and running into his brother. Such confrontations usually resulted in Dad's being severely scolded by Uncle Harry for some activity he had undertaken at Rokeby without consulting his co-owner. "Do you have any other work to do?" I shouted over the roar of the tractor engine. "Trench, lower barn," he shouted back. Dad's wiry hair was matted. His face and hands were smeared with grease, and his face was powdered with dust. The name tag on his used blue work shirt read Hank. His gray eyes looked kind and wise. I loved riding on the tractor fender like this, losing track of time in the vast greenness, grass seeds flying around our heads and scratchy bits of hay getting into our noses and eyes. As we drove, I watched a family of turkeys wobble past the rusted Rokeby windmill. Dad parked the tractor on the farm road at the edge of the barnyard and approached the yellow backhoe that he'd used to dig the trench by the lower barn. It stood next to a lonely fuel pump in the cluttered yard, its long hoe curled up behind it like a tail. The barnyard, although a sad version of what it had once been, was still the heart of Rokeby and Dad its pulse. In the southeast corner of the barnyard stood a red brick coach house designed by Stanford White. In the center was a U-shaped complex of white barns whose arms were still named according to their former purpose: the horse barn, the ox barn, the ice boat shed. Now the barn's siding was missing, roof tiles regularly blew to the ground, and doors hung off their hinges. Just past the main barn complex stood a yellow farmhouse that, while badly in need of paint, was surrounded by a well-trimmed lawn littered with prickly Chinese chestnuts. This was where Sonny Day, Rokeby's 70-year-old groundskeeper, lived. Sonny, who had worked at Rokeby since 1915, was one of the last human vestiges of the old farm days. These days, his duties were limited to mowing the lawns on an ancient riding mower and picking up the mail at a one-room post office down by the railroad tracks. Dad called today's Rokeby the funny farm. Nowadays, he used the barnyard to fix or store various broken tractor engines and appliances. Junk of all descriptions littered the yard: tires, old vacuum cleaners, broken fans, furnaces, lawn furniture, discarded washing machines, car transmissions. These were either donations from Dad's friends or leftovers from Rokeby's rental houses. Converted outbuildings like the old greenhouse, the old gardener's cottage, the creamery, and the milk house, whose tenants helped pay the property taxes. The hoe's gonna need some diesel. Hey, Roy, Dad's voice searched among furnaces and mowers. You here? Yeah, Teddy, over here. A one-armed man with a scruffy black beard and a woolen cap now appeared from below the iceboat shed. Just working on the bulldozer. Roy lived out in our woods in an old school bus with his family. Can you give the hoe some diesel? Roy was one of the many people Dad took under his wing and whom he taught to fix things on no budget, or entertained with stories about his adventures behind the Iron Curtain in the 60s. Like so many of Dad's mentees, Roy had become an expert iceboater under Dad's tutelage. One-armed Roy put fuel into the backhoe as I followed Dad into the horse barn. The stalls that had once been home to equine life now overflowed with detritus. As Dad poked around for some tools, I began picking up the garbage that cluttered the entrance and setting it aside in a pile. Wait just a minute. What are you doing with that? Dad stopped me. Just throwing away garbage. That stuff is useful. I'll go through it myself later. Dad was a wall that stopped anyone from creating order in his barns. Among these objects, Dad hoped to find the essence of a Rokeby now lost. It was his dream to revive this essence, to return to the way things were when his pop was still alive. My dream was to clean everything so that it might one day look presentable to outsiders. Hey, Alexandra, why don't you go out there and try to start up the backhoe? Me? But Dad, I'm only 10. It's about time you learned to drive a backhoe. I did at your age. I couldn't say no. I had to prove to Dad that I was tough, a true farm girl. So I climbed into the seat, its yellow stuffing poked out of the tears in its black plastic upholstery. Check the cheese in neutral now, Dad commanded from the horse barn's cluttered doorway. He had no patience for stupidity, so I didn't ask him how I was supposed to check. I just sat there, slumped and waiting. Go ahead and take the stick in your hand and see if it's loose, he said in feigned exasperation at what he saw as my girlish tentativeness. And I felt sorry that I wasn't a boy. I knew how much Dad had wanted a son, someone who could approximate his intimate relationship with Rokeby's land, buildings, and infrastructure when he was gone. As much as he let me tag along, I knew he would never see me as a proper heir. The best I could do was to act like a boy so that Dad would teach me to sail an ice boat, weld, dig trenches with the backhoe, and drive a tractor. I tried to move the stick shift. It's not loose, I reported. Step on the clutch, then move the stick into the middle where it'll wiggle freely. I did as Dad instructed, excited to learn. Now keep your left foot on the clutch as you turn the key. The key was slightly bent and hard to turn in the ignition. When I finally turned it, nothing happened. Need starter fluid. Dad began scavenging amid the debris. He rolled a tire onto its side and some water gushed out of it. He kicked an empty oil can. Finally, he found the starter fluid under a ripped blue tarp and sprayed something onto the uncovered engine that burned my lungs. I turned the key. As the backhoe roared to life, I felt a rush. Just as Dad was about to show me how to put the machine into reverse, Grandma Claire's lemon-colored Plymouth sailed into the barnyard and stopped abruptly. Grandma Claire opened the door and heaved her fragile body out of the low driver's seat. In her younger years, she had stood 6 feet tall, but now her back was badly hunched over. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunk deeply into her skull. Her frizzy, once black hair was now cut short and had long since turned salt and pepper. She stepped gingerly around the piles of metal in her red espadrilles. One-armed Roy darted out of sight. Grandma Claire lived down the hill, past the barnyard, in what had once been the chauffeur's garage. After Grandpa Dickey died in 1961, Grandma Claire had the garage converted to store her, instead of great-grandma Margaret's 39 Mercury. And for us, her granddaughters, Grandma Claire was indeed the chauffeur's replacement. She drove us to music lessons, the public library, doctor's appointments, stores, and parties. Grandma's skinny arms hung loosely from her torso, which was crunched up beneath the curve of her hunchback. She lifted them and waved at Dad, her son. Turn that thing off, her voice cracked with the desperation of a mother unable to control her child's errant behavior. Who allows their child to drive heavy farm machinery? Most of her R's disappeared into her old New England accent. Her father's family had been New Englanders, and Grandma had spent her first 10 years on Boston's North Shore. I shut off the engine. Since Grandma Claire paid all the bills, I felt obligated to listen to her. Teddy, I demand to know what's going on here. We were just testing out the backhoe in preparation for some possible digging. Dad generally tried to disarm the fierce females in his life with meek acquiescence, though he was rarely successful. The blood rose up Grandma Claire's neck like a rapid red tide. Her lips tightened, and she bared her large, once glamorous teeth like a mad dog. I suppose you think you're doing useful work here, do you? I suppose that digging up the place makes you feel better about not having a real job. In true aristocratic fashion, Dad had never learned a profession. He had attended elite private schools, then Harvard and Johns Hopkins. After college, he traveled around Eastern Europe for 6 years, picking up 5 languages along the way. He had a gentleman's education, charm, and endless stories, but little professionalism. The family viewed Dad's inability to conform to more middle-class norms as deliberate defiance, the mark of true failure, and the cause of all Rookby's current problems. But in fact, he was merely following tradition. Teddy, Alexandra, from across the yard, Mom called down to us from our third-floor window in the big house. Obiad, her words bent with her Polish accent as she invited us up for lunch. Obiad in Polish. Interrupted, Grandma Claire turned around and retreated to her car. I just don't understand it. I could hear her mumble to herself as she walked. It must be all my fault. We sent him to the best schools. Grandma had been brought up with the notion that a man must have a salaried career. Unlike Rookby's aristocratic Chandlers, the Cutlers, Grandma's family on her father's side, had been professional people. Her uncle Elliot Cutler had been a professor of medicine at Harvard and one of the first doctors in the United States to perform open-heart surgery. Another uncle had been chairman of the National Security Council under Eisenhower. Her father had been a senior partner at Smith Barney in New York City from the 1920s until his death in 1950. I climbed down from my seat of near triumph. "Coast's clear, Roy," Dad shouted into the barnyard. "You can come out now. Come up to the big house if you want lunch." I was resentful of Dad's collection of freeloaders, mostly people of questionable character and sanity, to whom Dad gave more attention than he did to me. Among the more memorable Rookby hangers-on were Bob the Ghost, a schizophrenic, the cryptic, menacing Walter, who, according to Dad, had robbed graves in Mexico before moving in with us, and Victoria, a diminutive Hungarian lady with dead gray hair and silver teeth, who lived on our living room sofa for a whole year and cried continually into her kerchief for her beloved homeland, rubbed her gnarled hands, and winced from the excruciating pain of her arthritis. Whenever I'd try to complain about them, Dad would give the same answer. My grandma had boarders living in her house in New York. The idea was that if you had a big house, you should have people staying there. Did I ever tell you about the Palestinian gentleman from Haifa whose father had been a planter? He lived on the 3rd floor and would kiss my grandmother's hand whenever he saw her. He had some questionable job to do with Jews in Palestine. And the major would never kiss my grandmother's hand. I tried to keep up with Dad's long strides as we walked up to the big house, passing the coach house where his pop used to have his machine shop. The thick soles of Dad's construction boots clipped the driveway's hard dirt. When he was a small kid, after the war in 46 and 47, Dad used to come up from New York on weekends with his pop. They would work in the machine shop where Grandpa Dickie would make parts for machines used on the farm, mostly tractors. He would use 19th century equipment like a lathe, shaper, grinder, and drill press. Dad told me that the shop used to be very dark with 15-watt bulbs hanging from the ceiling, and it would get very noisy with the flapping of belts and the squeaking and grinding of machines. The building would shake with all the machinery running. These had been happy weekends for Dad. Nowadays, Aunt Olivia kept her horses and goats there. So I don't have anything more that I want to say, really, because I'm just going to open up the room for questions at this point, so I don't take too long.
Hi, what was the incubation period?
Well, you mean before I started writing it, or? Oh, because, well, I returned to Rookby in 2005 when I was in the process of a divorce, and I'd become Jewish by then, and I thought that I put my past behind me and that, like, everything that happened before becoming Jewish was just nullified. But it turned out the past does catch up with you, and I ended up coming back here. And at first I was just sort of possessed by the same energy that I'd tried to escape from all those years, which was the need to fix everything, clean everything. So I kind of got manic about painting and fixing, and got on my dad. I finally learned how to drive the backhoe. I started pulling scrap metal out of the dump in the barnyard and loading it onto my dad's dump truck and bringing it to the scrap yard. And then eventually, because I was in the process of cleaning and fixing, I was revisiting all these old places that I'd grown up with, the fields and behind the barn and all. So I started to become, I was flooded by memories of my childhood. And also by then I was a mother, so I already was, it's just natural to start thinking about your childhood when you have a child of your own. So eventually, in 2008 I started writing, and the story just basically just flooded me. There was no decision about it. It just happened. I just started writing. And so it took 4 years not to write it, but from the time I started till the time to this, which takes it's just much more work than writing the book. There's a huge amount involved, and now I know.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Peter Bamford's mother.
Hi.
He sends his regrets that he couldn't be here.
Okay.
And I already have bought your book. I'd like you to sign it for me.
Could you
And
do
I
that?
don't know, have you ever seen this one?
Oh yes. Do you?
Have it?
Yes, we do. It's a bit unreadable. That's my great grandmother's self-published memoir.
Right.
I tried to read it. It's.
And it's first edition, and I got it in the used bookstore about 20 years ago.
Well, there's a reason why it was there. But I mean, by all means. Read it.
Well, that's how I got interested, because I have the other one too, the Astor.
Okay. Yes, right. So as I said before, everybody who's had any contact with Rookby has their own story, and so each one of those books is their own story as well.
Thank you.
Yes.
Are all the stories about your childhood, or do you grow up in the book?
No. Well, I ended at age 14 because that's when I went away to boarding school, and it didn't seem. I thought I played with the idea of talking about my later, what I did afterwards, but I just wanted this to be a Rookby story, and initially I envisioned it as something like The Color of Water, and I thought maybe I would alternate chapters between my narrative growing up at Rookby and my father's story. But in the end, I peppered the narrative with my father's stories of his childhood misadventures, which were such a delight to grow up with. So it was just too hard to structure it that way, to keep a narrative flow. Yeah.
I just have a quick question.
Yeah.
I haven't seen you since you were little, but my name is Ripley Gollivan Hathaway, but I did know you when you were really little. My question is this: since it is an autobiography, why did you change the names of the principal people?
That's a good question, because it's so easy to. It's not anonymous at all, and you can read it. Not even to you, but to anybody. Anyone can Google Rookby and find out who the principal players are. But I thought it would be too jarring for them to see their names in print, especially since some of them may not like this book. So I thought, because it just conflicts with their stories, their interpretation points of view. But it does seem silly, but it's a way of placating the family.
Okay, that's what I thought, but I just
But
wanted to ask.
yeah,
Alexandra?
yes.
Deirdre and I just finished reading the book aloud to each other, just last night, in fact. It's a treasure, and we both recognize, we've known you since you were very young, as you know, but we recognize the writing talent that you've exhibited in this, quite apart from the content. It's terrific. It's fascinating.
Thank you. Thank you. So I did think, when I was growing up, people would visit the property all the time. Strangers or acquaintances. I mean, most of you know, because you've been there. And sometimes, nobody in my family really wanted to talk to me about what was going on in my life. It wasn't acceptable to talk about feelings. I was told that it's embarrassing to talk about feelings. It's a sign of weakness. It could even be considered impolite. So sometimes I'd catch the ear of a visitor, and I'd tell them, listen, I just want to tell you. I'm not going to tell you the details, but I wish I didn't live here. And they'd say, how could you feel that way? This is such an amazing place, and you have such an interesting family. And they'd say, don't worry about it. One day you'll have a great book to write. So, and actually, talking about incubation, it was in the back of my head for a long time, back of my mind for a long time to write the book.
Now, not to put you on the spot, but will you take this talent forward?
I hope so. I hope to.
So too.
Were you conflicted? I mean, growing up, and it sounded like there was a part of you that was adjusting to a normal life, going to school, public school, and then there was this other part of you, and it sounds like there were a duality of personalities that you brought into the, let's say, I don't want to use the word normal for normal, but the normal world, and then the one back in Rokeby.
Right.
And did you have best friends in school? And
Yeah, most of my friends were not from my school because I was very conscious of keeping that double life separate, and I'm sorry that was the case because I don't think that was healthy at all for me. And writing this book has largely been about reconciling myself with all the parts of my story. So I include a lot of history, but I also include a lot about my mother's life and my father's life and our life as a family. So I feel like it's an updated history. But yeah, I was ashamed to bring people home. So I kept my distance a little bit in elementary school. And I also, like I said before, I felt like I had to be so perfect. It was like I was always on stage. I always felt like I was, I had to get straight A's and be like the best. And it's hard to be friends with your peers when you have that attitude. Yeah.
Like Wilderstein, they lost most of their money in '29. When did the Aldrich family actually lose their fortune, so to say?
It didn't happen overnight. It was my great-grandmother, Margaret Chandler Aldrich, she lived to be almost 100, and she lived on her money. She had a house in Manhattan, she had Rokeby, she had a staff of workers, she ran a dairy farm at a loss on the property. So when she died, that's what was left, was the property. And not because it was lost in the Depression. I mean, I don't know how much she had invested. I don't know the details about that. But she didn't go broke in the 30s. And I just want to say, we're the country Astors, right? So that's why William B. Astor, who's the great-grandfather of Vincent Astor, who married Brooke, is also my great-great-great-great-grandfather. But I'm descended from his daughter, Emily. So when she married Sam Ward, the name Astor disappeared from our line. And my line has always stayed at Rokeby. So the New York Astors are known for, having invested well, became great philanthropists, were socialites, and they kept the money. And Vincent Astor started a foundation with it.
And when did the dairy farm cease to exist? When your grandmother
I
died?
think until the very end. Yeah, very close to the end. From 1900 when she established it, so over 60 years. Yes.
On C-SPAN, the year before he died, Ryan Lamb hosted a show called Footnotes, which you've probably seen.
Yeah.
My question is, one of the things he always asks the writers on the show is, where did you write the book? Or how did you write the book?
Okay, well, I couldn't have written the story if I hadn't been living at Rokeby. There's no way I could have written the story in Brooklyn.
Okay.
Because and I feel like when you write a memoir, you have to go back to the place where the memories happened.
Okay.
And that's why I said before that the memories just flooded me when I was at Rokeby. And I thought that I could keep the past behind me, but I couldn't. Once I was at Rokeby, it caught up with me. And I'm happy it did. I feel much lighter about the past now that I've written this book.
So you wrote the book exclusively when you were at Rokeby?
Yes, but actually I didn't write at Rokeby because Rokeby itself is a very distracting place. You cannot concentrate and get any work done because people are constantly coming and going. So I actually went to the Bard Library most of the time to write. Yeah.
Did your grandmother or your great-grandmother ever talk about the relationships that Astor ancestors had with maybe the Vanderbilts or the Rockefellers or things like that? I mean, were they at odds or did they get along?
That's a good question. I think that my great-grandmother and her, she wasn't very social. She wasn't a socialite. They were country people.
Okay,
And she'd grown up as an orphan, living, with her siblings. They were raised at Rokeby. They'd inherited about $5 million of William B. Astor's fortune, but they were not socialites. They were not sophisticated at all. And they lived outside of any kind of rules of society. And their great aunt, Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, who was the head of high society in New York City, she tried to refine them and bring them into her social circles, but they weren't interested in that. So they were very rich, but they were eccentrics.
Now, my last question. A lot of the Gilded Age people, the post and the pre-Gilded Age people, considered John David Rockefeller because of the climbing that he did in the business world to be sort of like a pariah? Did your family feel the same way?
I don't know. See, I don't know how they interacted with other. I don't even know. I don't think they interacted at all. That's
Okay.
pretty much.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if it's your cousin, Laura Middleton.
Yeah.
Is she a cousin?
She's she's a half cousin. She's half.
Yeah,
She's my
my daughter.
Aunt Olivia, whose name is changed in the book. She was married before, so she had 2 teenage children, and Laura was one of them. Is one of them.
Yeah, because I know she went to Rhinebeck
Yeah.
with my daughter
Okay.
back in.
Yeah, in the 70s.
And then Peter knew you
Right.
from what, 7th and 8th grade
Yeah.
or
Right.
something like that.
Very.
That's how you did get the connection. Thank you.
Has your perspective changed now from growing up at Rookby, how you felt in the book versus how you feel about it now?
Well, yeah, it changed dramatically. I think that I didn't plan it this way, but because I collected my father's stories and then I started reading more about my ancestors, I realized that I came to see that we are a lot like our ancestors, and that all the behavior and character traits that I found difficult when I was growing up really came from, had precedence in the past. When I was a kid, I always believed that the ancestors were perfect. They were in these beautiful gilt-framed portraits, and we, at first I thought I could keep up, and then we failed, and I thought we were just broken, and we had failed to live up to the standard of perfection. But so reading, it was just so refreshing to read about how really messed up they were. They just had more money, so it seemed like they were perfect. They could get themselves memorialized this way, but in fact, so I've come to a great understanding of why we are the way we are, and that's helped me be more empathetic and less angry. Yeah.
Not from this area, but is your family still living there?
Yes, yes. It's much different now. They always want me to say that things have changed. This was the 70s and early 80s. That was the lowest point in the family's history because it was my grandmother and her 3 children were still trying to figure out how to run this property jointly with no money. And so they had conflicting visions of what they wanted Rookby to be, so there's a lot of conflict. But nowadays, it's much more civilized, it's in much better condition, and it's rented out for weddings and photo shoots. Yeah, so it's doing better. It's doing great, actually.
That's great.
Yeah. Yeah, yes.
Are you in touch with your cousin Margot?
Margot Yuri? Yeah,
Their grandma?
yeah, I haven't seen her in a really long time.
Goodman.
Yeah, I haven't seen her in a really long time, but I might get back in touch with her.
I
She
met
was-
her in 1959. She became a client of mine when I had a health retreat in Statsburg, our very first client.
Wow.
And she asked me to drive her to see one of her relatives one time. She spent a lot of time with us. And I didn't know where I was going because I was new to the area. We went down River Road, and we ultimately came to a place called Rokeby. We turned in, and she led me up to the 3rd floor where Aunt Margaret was not feeling well and was in bed. And, oh, darling, oh, it was so wonderful. We had a great reunion. And as we left, Aunt Margaret said to Margot, oh, darling, be sure to show her Teddy's painting. So we go down the hallway, and on the wall, I think it might have been, you would know, either a painting or a mural, a jungle scene. And it was signed Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, interesting. There are a lot of artifacts like that in the house. That's what makes it so interesting, yeah.
So we went down, and Margot was pointing out different things to me and telling me. And we went into the drawing room on the bottom floor where there were walls of books.
The library.
And I was looking through the books, and Margot said, pick one out. You can have it.
Whoa. Don't tell my uncle that you
So I saw one that was a written by another one of your relatives who was he worked for the New York Times. And
Richard Aldrich, the music critic?
Yes.
That's my
Richard
great-grandfather,
Aldrich.
yes.
And I saw one chapter in that book about ballads, old English ballads.
Yeah, it's called Musical Discourse, that's right.
Yes,
So, yeah.
and so I said, I'll take this one because I grew up in that area.
Very nice.
Kentucky
Oh,
and so forth.
oh.
And I treasure that little book. I've had it for all these years. That's been over 50 years.
Wow. It's a few collectors in the audience.
Recently,
Very nice.
Your uncle autographed it for
Oh,
me, and I treasure it. It's
very
one
nice.
of my prized
Thank you,
possessions.
thank you. Yeah, Tatiana.
I have two questions.
Yeah.
One is, how did Judaism help you to form an identity so you had a certain perspective, looking back and kind of having your own life? And my second question is, like, how do you deal with other family members not being so happy with this book?
Oh, it's two very, very different topics.
Well,
Well,
about your life and how you...
first of all, by the time I left Rokeby, I was a little confused about who I was already because you have to read the book to understand that I really kind of lost all the parts of my identity that I didn't lose them, but I felt like I couldn't be a farm girl anymore. I couldn't be a creative spirit because the family judged creative bohemian artists. I wasn't the aristocrat because I'd failed. So, and I didn't really know who I was. So in my late teens, early 20s, I was looking for an identity that would click with who I was, who I wanted to be. And so Judaism was it. I mentioned at the end of the book how I loved reading Isaac Bashevis Singer in my early teens, just because I was very drawn to the idea of the shtetl life, and the sheltered, self-contained world where everybody lived by the same rules and the same moral codes. Because at Rookby, everyone had their own rules and their own moral codes. And where family, was sacred, and raising children is sacred, and it was like all the attention is on the children. So I was drawn to that, and then later, when I was in Poland, I started to become interested in Judaism. But it just, there was so much there's so much structure. I hate to say it, my friends, but don't say that because it makes Judaism sound like rule-bound and boring. But that really was part of it for me because I didn't really know how to interact with people so well. Growing up in Rookby, I was very isolated from the real world. And my main connections with the real world, or the outside world, had been through my grandmother, going to tea parties, going to classical music concerts, going to church. But those were very structured activities. So, Judaism tells you exactly how to interact. If you have a question, what do I do in this situation? You can call your rabbi, or you can look it up in the Gemara. There's always an answer, which I love. And then the second question, I haven't had any negative feedback about the book. And, in my family, it's not a lot of open dialogue. So if somebody's angry, they're probably not going to tell me. But my parents I was very surprised by my parents' reaction. My father, in his inimitable way, he said, I just can't read this. It has so much dialogue. It's just so boring. I said, well, if you're bored, that's a really good sign. I'm really happy, but you have to read it because he had to sign off on it, that it was true. And he read it all, and I said, no, do you have anything to say? Because I was nervous about it. And he said, well, you got some details about the farm machinery wrong. So that was very relieving. And then my mother, she said, oh, I confirm all the facts. It's very accurate portrayal, but I don't agree with your feelings. So I thought those were very typical responses. Yes?
Joe Homer Kennedy of the Kennedy family always told his family that they had to give something back. Now, did your family with Rogueby, were they told that Rogueby was an important place that needed to be shared with the community?
Well, like I mentioned, my father had that really, noblesse oblige attitude. He's always had that, where he's wanted to bring people onto the property and put them up in the house and use up all the rooms. My grandmother had a very different attitude towards guests. Her favorite adage was, guests are like fish. After 3 days, they begin to stink. So there was always a conflict. He'd bring people in, and she'd drive them out. But my great-grandmother, Margaret, was very charitable. In her early days, before she moved back to Rookby and bought out her siblings and became the sole owner, she joined the Red Cross as a nurse's aide, and she built hospitals for the wounded in the Spanish-American War and in the Boxer Rebellion. Yeah, and then she volunteered at the Tuskegee Institute, teaching freed slaves to read and write. So she was influenced by her great aunt Julia Ward Howe, the author of the Battle Hymn of the Republic, who is a very famous activist. So yeah, she fought for women's suffrage. So yeah, she did. I don't know how much money she gave in the end, but she was very charitable.
Okay,
Thanks.
okay.
So we can, yeah. Take a few
So,
more.
do you find yourselves gestating ideas for your sequel?
Well, I don't have to. I mean, if it's going to be another memoir, it would certainly be about, you know, my mother's side of the family, because I grew up with all this. I grew up so inundated by the history of my father's side of the family, and I always wanted to take my. I mean, my mother didn't want to be rescued, but I always wanted to rescue her from Rokeby. I thought this place just. I knew from a young age that it was overwhelming for her. I wanted to take her back to Poland, where I idealized. I'd visited a few times, and I idealized the communism, because it seemed to me that everybody was poor, everybody was equal, and nobody was homeless. They were like taken care of. So I liked that idea. But I don't know if my mother's family is going to be cooperative, but I would like to talk about going to Poland and finding Judaism for sure. A couple more questions and we'll wrap it up. Yeah.
Are you an only child?
Well, no, you have to read the book and you'll find out. Okay, so I don't know if we don't have any other questions, or we could take one more and then we'll start signing, I think, because it might take a while. Okay. Okay, good. So thank you. What? Okay, my hands. I'm tired. Well, I was on the radio. I had to go on Leonard Lopate, and so that I really prepared myself because I was terrified. I was like, you can't mess up on Leonard.
That really helped me. My husband was a rabbi, I'm glad I came.
Somewhere way back there.
Purple jacket.
I know, I'm not